The following account is real. Names have been changed to protect the living and the innocent. This journal contains language and content that may not be suitable for all listeners.
Working at a funeral home can ravage your personal life. Mine is hanging on by a thread at the moment, and I'm choosing to blame it more on my employment and less on the fact that I'm turning into a careless, drug addict musician without any real plan for the rest of his life. Anyway, I went a little too hard last night, and I'm not sure my brain is in the best condition to process what I'm about to see. Whether it's two naked dead teenagers lying on the floor of their garage or some super shady text messages from some dipshit that's trying to get into my girlfriend's pants. Either way, I'm not sure I'm ready. My name is Grant, and these are my funeral home stories. Chapter 11. Naked Dead Lovers. It's 8:35 on Saturday morning, the third week of August and the second week of my senior year of music school. I'm 21 years old and I feel like shit right now. I may have taken a few too many drugs last night, or maybe I just took them too late last night and I'm still a little fucked up. Whatever I am, I'm too much of it not to hide in the basement and pretend to do busy work this morning. My band Templeton played a private house party at our guitarist Eugene's house last night to test out some of our new material and celebrate the beginning of fall. But mostly it was just a reason to be reckless. Without going into too many incriminating details, the band and I may have experimented with some disassociatives last night. So my motor skills and cognitive abilities are limited today, to say the least. I have the slightest headache developing near the center of my forehead and traveling down my face. I'm clammy all over my body and I'm completely mentally disheveled. Other than that, though, I feel pleasantly paranoid and content alone in the basement. Saturdays are becoming impossible at the funeral home, especially with my carelessness and moonlighting. I assume that dumping copious amounts of caffeine into my belly will help offset my cognition issues, so that's what I'm doing. I throw the second empty energy drink can I've had this morning across the room, making it into a small steel trash can. Swish. I didn't make can number 1. In fact, it's still laying on the ground next to the trash can from my missed attempt. After sinking the can, I feel optimistic approaching my busy workstation for the morning in the far corner of our cold and damp basement. It's the perfect place to come down from last night while not being around anyone who might be cognizant of my semi-faded condition. I'm now standing over a metal card table covered by 2 large boxes, one filled with folders, one filled with contents for the folders. Guess what my job is? I'm having trouble focusing this morning. I wonder what Mary and I are going to have for dinner tonight. We haven't had a nice dinner since she's been back from Salt Lake. I hope we get Chinese. My job today is to put a 3-page general price list, a pamphlet on prearranging funeral services, and a pen with our funeral home's name and logo on it inside a navy blue matte finish 2-pocket folder, also with our name on it. It's a pretty tedious job, but it needs to be done. We give these folders out to every family that comes in, so we need to have a lot of them on hand. You don't want to feel the wrath of my dad when we run out of folders. It's not pretty. Although this job is mindless and simple enough to be done in my sleep, my current condition is making it difficult to see why I need to be doing this at all this morning. The room starts to gently spin. I feel lightheaded and sit down in an old beige folding chair next to the lightly rusted card table. I'm about an arm's length from the cabinet of unwanted cremains containing my old friend Eli Wales. I think about opening the cabinet to check on Eli, but considering my vertigo, I just need a minute to sit down and stew in my fogginess. I push play on the small single-speaker CD player I brought from home sitting next to me on the floor, plugged into the wall with an absurdly long orange extension cord. The mixed CD I brought from home ramps up to speed inside the cheap plastic excuse for a boombox. It whirls loudly and I think to myself, what did I do to my brain last night? I gotta rub my eyes with my hands and realize I'm sweating profusely. I close my eyes for a moment. Why do I always pretend to be a rock star on nights when I have to work bright and early the next morning? Is this what being an adult is? Making poor decisions most every night and paying for them when you wake up? Is that sustainable? I may need to slow down. My thought is interrupted by the intro to the song Nemo by the band Humphreys McGee off their album Safety in Numbers. I like this song a lot. The volume is set to barely audible for obvious reasons, but I can still make out the lyric. Every time we seem aware of all that matters, there will always be a memory you forget. That lyric strikes me every time I hear this song, but it rings louder and truer this morning, probably for the wrong reasons. I mean, I'm fairly certain I'm aware of all that matters because I somehow made it to work at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning after apparently doing enough drugs to make me mostly forget what drugs I even took in the first place. Shit. I lost my train of thought, and I'm not entirely sure where I was going with that, but it seemed like it was going to be profound. Maybe it'll come back to me later. Seriously though, why do I insist on burning the candle at both ends so frequently? I decide to stand up after Jake's guitar solo and get to work looking busy since my vertigo or whatever the fuck I was having subsided. I start filling folders, slowly but steadily placing a price list, pamphlet, and pen inside each folder before stacking them neatly in another box on the ground to be taken upstairs after completion. My hands are shaking from a lack of dopamine, but thankfully this job doesn't require any fine motor skills, so it shouldn't be much of a problem. The funeral home phone rings. It stops. Ned must have picked it up upstairs in the operating room. Ned has been prepping a body for visitation tomorrow night since we opened up this morning. Mr. McKellen. Nathaniel McKellen. Mr. McKellen has been quite a handful after his death. I went on his removal 2 nights ago, and it was business as usual until I reached my hand under Mr. McKellen's legs and realized I had slid my gloved hand and the left sleeve of my white Van Heusen dress shirt through a newly evacuated and quite runny post-death bowel movement. The family was in the room with us while we made the removal, making sure their father and husband's last moments in their home together were dignified. This made it difficult to wince or gag, so I didn't do either. The family noticed the stain on the bed and on my shirt, but neither of us mentioned it. Needless to say, I had to throw away a perfectly good dress shirt that evening and couldn't shake the smell of shit inside my nose all night and the following day. I gotta say, I've been on a pretty good streak of not ruining any dress clothes for the last year or so. I mean, I'm still not completely over throwing away my favorite tie. The Ralph Lauren blue, black, and gray diagonal pattern necktie that I accidentally dipped in smelly blood at the police station last winter. You know, the night Andy freaked out because I almost shot him moving a frozen dead body, and then he ate my Butterfinger. I'm a little bit more careful these days, with my clothes and my candy bars. Anyway, Ned is upstairs dealing with the second wave of grossness coming out of Mr. McKellen's body. Embalming a body can be tricky for a number of reasons. 1, it takes skill. 2, it takes working equipment. And 3, bodies aren't always the most cooperative or receptive to the embalming process. Mr. McKellen had bad circulation in his bottom half, so although his head and upper torso are preserved and embalmed, his legs, which didn't have much embalming fluid pumped into them, are starting to decompose and ooze out yellow and greenish liquid. We were greeted by a large pool of this fluid on the floor under Mr. McKellen's dressing table this morning when we opened up. This sent Ned into a bigger panic than he was already in, having worried about the shoddily embalmed legs all night. I left Ned in the prep room and opened up the rest of the funeral home and made my way down to the basement quickly after seeing this. I wasn't really in the mood to clean up smelly leg juice with Ned first thing this morning. Today is definitely a day I need to ease into, and I really don't want our pal, Mr. McKellen, to ruin any more of my clothes. Ned's got this. I finish a folder and place it in the box at my feet. The intercom in the basement beeps, and in a soft-spoken tone without even asking if I'm near the phone, Ned tells me to meet him upstairs with our second stretcher. We have a police call with 2 bodies. We need to lock up and go. I say okay and grab our second stretcher from a large storage room and take the elevator to meet Ned in the garage. We load both stretchers side by side in the back of our black Chrysler Town & Country minivan. There's just enough room. We're on our way now. Ned must be able to sense that I'm in a mood or hungover, so he doesn't insist on talking much. Instead, he relays the pertinent details about the call that he got from dispatch. 2 dead inside a house. That's it. I look at Ned and scoff. What's the deal, Ned? Your guy not working today? Ned rolls his eyes. He's annoyed with my tone and probably equally annoyed by the fact that he didn't get much information from his normally chatty dispatch operator. They just told me we gotta get there ASAP, Ned says. I spend most of the ride over to the police call debating whether or not I'm going to tell Mary about how fucked up I got last night. She was invited to the show and house party, but she had one of her chemistry study group meetings at 8, so she couldn't come. I feel like maybe I shouldn't get into too many specifics with her. Just tell her the band played well and we had a few drinks afterwards. I've been on thin ice, or perceived thin ice, since she got back from Salt Lake and her internship. Remember the practical chemistry internship? The one I had no idea what it was? Well, she's been back for a couple weeks now, and I wouldn't say we're quite back to where we left off. Since Mary got back, she texts and calls me a lot less. A couple of days ago, she forgot to text me altogether. She told me she was too busy at school to check in. Her tone and patience levels with me fluctuate a lot less now, which sounds better than it is because she's been mostly annoyed with me since she's gotten back. It probably doesn't help that our first date night back was interrupted by a homeless man who decided to take a nap on train tracks. I'll tell you, picking up pieces of someone doesn't sound like a huge task, but it takes time. So Mary wasn't too happy that she was stuck watching Knowing starring Nicolas Cage by herself. In fact, she was so annoyed she turned it off and left before I got back. Mary yelled at me on the phone for about an hour that night because she blew off plans with some of her new friends and wasn't happy about it. Apparently, Mary joined some competitive collegiate chemistry team. I don't know what they actually do competitively, but she literally had no interest in competitive chemistry until she was in Salt Lake. So, most likely, I think it may have something to do with wanting to spend time with one of her other interns. Some asshole named Mike. Ned and I turn into an apartment complex that I'm considerably familiar with. South Point Apartments. You see, before I started dating Mary 3 years ago, I actually went on a few dates with a girl that lived here. She worked at a tanning salon and turned out to be a total lunatic and a pretty awful kisser. Oh my god, what if we're picking her up? That would be nuts. But why would we need 2 cots? Did she murder-suicide somebody? Now that I'm thinking about it, she doesn't even live in the state anymore, so we can't be picking her up. Ned looks down at the address he wrote on his miniature notepad and points to a bi-level townhouse right in front of us. That's it. It's the one with the garage. Unit 2424. There's only one police car parked in front of the townhouse. Not uncommon for a crime scene on a Saturday morning. An officer I recognize but don't know by name sees us and gets out of his car and moves towards us. Ned and I both smile at him as he approaches, but he doesn't even crack a grin. Ned rolls down the window and the officer tells us what's going on. Hey guys, did you bring 2 cots? He looks in around Ned's shoulders to see the 2 stretchers side by side in the back of our van. Oh, okay, good. The officer looks around nervously before he gives us any deets. I don't think anyone's watching him in the neighborhood. Everyone's probably sleeping in or already at work by now. Watching a police officer look over his shoulder before speaking strikes me as unusual today. Maybe it's the hangover, or maybe it's just an unusual situation. In almost a whisper, the officer begins to explain the situation that we found ourselves in this morning. Okay, so we have to be discreet. This is a busy neighborhood, and we have 2 naked dead bodies inside this garage. The officer points behind him. I look over at the closed garage door and wonder what happened inside. I'm hoping it's something unique, but not too disgusting. I can barely feel my headache now, and the energy drinks I had earlier at the funeral home made me much more alert and curious. The officer tells us that there are 2 19-year-old college freshmen in the garage in front of us, naked and very much dead. My brain can't make any sense of this at first. Suicide? Ned lobs a one-word question into the air, and we're both eagerly awaiting a response. The officer says, well, sort of. More of an accident than a suicide, but still technically a suicide. Carbon monoxide poisoning. I think to myself before the officer continues. The 2 were an item. They met in high school and were enrolled at the same university together this fall. The officer tells us their names. Rachel and Scott. This is Scott's parents' townhouse. Rachel and Scott were both visiting home to attend their alma mater's homecoming football game. After the game, the couple told Rachel's parents they were spending the night at Scott's. We think they arrived back at the house between 12:45 and 1:15 a.m. this morning. That's right around the time my evening of partying ramped up. Now, in fairness, I don't remember a whole lot past midnight. The officer tells us that the couple parked the car inside the garage and closed the overhead door behind them, but they didn't turn the car off. Rachel and Scott hopped into the back seat and fooled around until they both eventually fell asleep or passed out from the overwhelming presence of carbon monoxide in the air and in their bloodstreams. Scott's dad found him when he was getting ready to leave for work and opened the door from the house to the garage and was greeted by large, unruly, rolling clouds of exhaust and the glow of red parking lights reflecting off the garage door and the smoke inside the garage. The officer's tone gets even more grave now. We have to be discreet. I guess a lot of kids they went to high school with live in this neighborhood, so we should probably move as quick as possible since we may have onlookers who may be very close to the victim. I always hate when police officers tell us this shit. What the fuck does he think we're gonna do? Drag these kids out of the garage by their feet and toss them in the back of the van like garbage for the whole neighborhood's amusement? Come on. Ned and I park and exit the van. We pull both stretchers out of the van and start walking to the side door of the garage. The officer tells us we'll be able to use the main door to take the bodies out. He just doesn't want to open the overhead door until the bodies are decent and there is zero possibility of seeing a dead body from outside the garage. Considering the possibility of onlookers, this makes sense to Ned and I. So are they both still in the car? I asked the officer. No, the paramedics moved them out when they were trying to save their lives. They're both laying on a tarp on the ground next to the car. The side door swings open to the garage, and I'm immediately hammered by the smell of exhaust pouring out of the door and into Ned and I's nostrils. The headache that I thought was disappearing is now creeping back up to prominence. As we walk in, I try to limit my breathing, only inhaling when absolutely necessary. 3 rows of white fluorescent light bulbs illuminate the scene when we step into the garage on the passenger side of the car. The bodies must be on the other side of this late 90s hunter green 4-door Pontiac Bonneville. It's an older car, but it seems to be in pretty great shape. Somebody must have taken real good care of this. As I follow Ned and the officer around the front of the car, I see a shiny silver Superman logo on a silver chain hanging from the rearview mirror. The officer says, "Right there," and points to 2 dead teenagers laying under the bright lights on a crinkled blue landscaping tarp. Oh, I'm glad he pointed them out. I may have missed the 2 dead teenagers sitting in front of me. The tarp they're laying on is the kind of tarp that you'd rake leaves onto before you carry them into the street for pickup. It's kind of weird. I'm assuming the paramedics didn't want to just leave the bodies on the bare garage floor. They're naked. It would have been kind of weird if they would have just left them on the bare concrete, right? Ned and I prepare our stretchers for the bodies and put our gloves on. The inside of the garage door has a large black soot spot from where the exhaust was pouring out of the Bonneville's tailpipe all night. I take a closer look at the bodies at my feet and see the most glaring sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. Both bodies are cherry red, like head to toe, red. So why does a body turn red that's been exposed to a deadly amount of carbon monoxide? Well, I'm not entirely sure why. Something about cells trying to use carbon monoxide inside the body as if it were oxygen, but I don't fucking know. I feel like Mary might be better at answering this sort of thing since she understands chemical reactions a little better than I do, but she's not a physiologist, so it might not make a lot of sense to her either. I wonder what she's doing right now. Probably sleeping or studying. She hasn't texted me yet this morning, which is weird considering she's an early riser and we have a date tonight. I wonder if she's with Mike. Now I'm wondering how much she actually likes me as I'm staring at these 2 naked dead people. I look closer at the bodies, and aside from being completely red head to toe, there doesn't seem to be any sign of discomfort or agony from their slow death together. It's probably important to point out that this sort of coloring in a body can occur in other circumstances, not just carbon monoxide poisoning. According to an old embalming textbook I have lying around, a body can develop cherry red coloring from hypothermia, cyanide poisoning, and because of over-refrigeration, aka freezer burn. It's also important to note that a good embalmer can break up all of this unwanted wine staining with the right injection method and patience. Looking past the coloring of the bodies, I finally see them as a couple, or I imagine what they would have been like if they were a living couple. I think they would have been cute. They were both small and slim in stature. Scott must have been 5'7", and Rachel appeared a little shorter laying next to him on the tarp. Scott has a short, military-style haircut, a gold chain around his neck, and a large black Superman logo tattooed on his left pectoral, just over his heart. I snicker silently to myself when I think about how ironic it is that he's brandishing the Superman logo in this moment. I don't think carbon monoxide would put Superman down. Kryptonite, maybe, but carbon monoxide? Nah. Rachel has shoulder-length, dirty blonde hair and no visible tattoos or piercings. There is something unique about Rachel's body, though. She has a large white spot starting at her forehead and moving all the way down the right side of her face. Ned points to the spot and says, "She must have been lying on her face, and her carbon monoxide-rich blood wasn't able to travel to circulate the suffocated cells to that part of her face, hence the white spot." Ned tells me not to worry about her face, and the spot will fade during the embalming. But I won't hold my breath after the bang-up job Ned did embalming Mr. McKellen this week, aka Mr. Stanky Leg. Ugh. I'm looking around the garage and I can't help but shake my head. How the fuck did these two make such a careless mistake? I think about how many times I've had sex in a car and how I've never imagined it ending in death. Do you suppose they were cold, so they left the heat on, or do you think Scott just forgot to turn off the engine after the garage was shut because things were moving at a hot and heavy pace between him and Rachel? Before we move the body, I ask the officer if the parents are still here. He says no and holds up a large silver key. The parents couldn't bear to see their kids hauled off in body bags this morning, so they went to a family member's house across town. Honestly, I'm happy I won't be forced to interact with any sobbing parents today. The K-hole I was in last night is making it difficult to do anything. I couldn't imagine trying to relate to any newly grieving parents. The bodies are loaded onto their respective stretchers without incident and are loaded into the van. On my way back to the funeral home, the lyrics from the song I was listening to earlier during my vertigo fit in the basement found their way back into my brain. I say the lyric out loud, but under my breath. Every time we seem aware of all that matters, there will always be a memory you forget. Later that night, Mary and I are having dinner, takeout Chinese. I lobbied pretty hard for it. I'm feeling much better now. Less hungover, more alert, but still a little foggy. Honestly, I'm still shocked I managed to hear my alarm this morning. Mary ordered veggie fried rice, egg drop soup, and spring rolls. I opted for kung pao chicken, hot and sour soup, and 2 regular egg rolls. There hasn't been much conversation at the dinner table this evening. It's mostly silverware sounds and the occasional tapping of Carter's tail on the tile floor across the room when one of us makes eye contact with him. Carter's a pretty well-behaved dog. He's not much of a beggar. I smile at him from across the room. His tail happily bangs on the floor. Mary breaks the lull and asks me if anything interesting happened at work today. I said, no, not really, knowing that generally she doesn't care for details about death calls or most any occurrence that might be considered interesting to me. There's an awkward silence after I answer, punctuated by the sound of my fork sliding against a plate, scooping a heaping bite of rice up in front of my face. I push the fork into my mouth and smile at Mary. I'm imagining the color of those 2 teenagers' skin and trying to find anything in my home that's a match. There's a red Yankee candle sitting on the island in my kitchen that's pretty close. I think it's supposed to smell like a bushel of apples. Or an apple. Not really sure what the difference would be. I remember the smell of the exhaust as Ned and I entered the garage this morning, and I almost lose my appetite at the thought of the 2 wasted lives in the backseat of that car. What do you think their parents are doing tonight? Do you suppose the 2 sets of parents will stay in touch after the funerals? I wouldn't think so. I'd want to get as far away from anyone involved as possible. I mean, every time they'd see each other, all they could think about is each other's dead kids, right? That seems like it would be a pretty big unaddressable elephant in the room. I mean, Rachel's parents must hold Scott's parents at least a little bit responsible, right? I don't know though, his parents were probably already asleep when they pulled the car into the garage. But wouldn't someone have heard something before morning, or smell something? I watch Mary staring down at her plate, picking out the bean sprouts from her rice, and I continue to think about the family from earlier today. Do you think they'll keep the car? I hope not. I wouldn't want to keep the car my son died in. but I wonder how many miles are on it. Mary sets her fork down on the table and excuses herself to the bathroom. My dog Carter follows her, of course. He loves her. We both do. It's cute. I take a sip of tepid hot and sour soup and slurp a long piece of stringy meat into my mouth, chewing it but not enjoying the temperature and consistency. I look at Mary's cartoonishly yellow egg drop soup and immediately an image of Mr. McKellen's oozing legs pop into my head. I lose my appetite in an instant and put my fork down next to my plate on the table. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm still curious whether or not Ned was able to preserve Mr. McKellen's legs or if we're going to come in on Sunday afternoon to frozen bananas. My phone vibrates. Wait, that's Mary's phone. It's sitting on her side of the table. I decide not to look. I don't want to be that guy. It's not a cool move to be a jealous boyfriend. At least I don't think so. It vibrates again 2 more times quickly. Okay, this seems urgent. I should look, right? What if it's her parents and something happened at home? What if someone is dead in their garage? Does it seem like I'm trying to find reasons to justify looking at Mary's phone while she's in the other room? Perhaps. Against my better judgment, I lean across the table and turn her phone so I can read it clearly. 3 new text messages. From Mike. 1. Hey. 2. What are you doing? 3. And probably the most incriminating. I miss you. My stomach flips when I read the 3rd text. I miss you? The fuck does that mean? Why would Mary's chemistry classmate miss her? In a flash, I imagine Mike and Mary making out in the backseat of her car outside their shared chemistry building. I hear the wooden sliding bathroom door open and turn Mary's phone back how it was laying before she left and make sure the LCD screen is asleep. My brain just starts eating itself. She just spent like 2 months in Salt Lake City with this guy doing what? Chemistry problems? And he misses her? Why? Are his chemistry problems too hard without her? I miss you. That's only something you say to family members and people you're dating or want to be dating. And I don't think Mike and Mary are related. Oh my god, I bet they've been fucking all summer. I feel foolish and sick the more I think about it. Mary, followed by Carter, sits back down at the table and looks at her phone, and then quickly looks at me to gauge if I had seen any of the messages. I'm petting Carter and telling him what a good boy he is, but looking at Mary using my peripheral vision, I don't react. She seems relieved and she slips her phone into her pocket. I pick up my fork and although I have no appetite, I finish what's left on my plate of the Kung Pao chicken. I take a deep breath in and relax. There's something comforting about landing in your worst case scenario, especially if you're prepared for it. I decide not to make a fuss about the text tonight. I've already had too long of a day. I really don't want to stay up all night fighting. I smile at Carter sitting on the floor next to me, and his tail bangs on the tile in mute approval. My name is Grant, and these are my funeral home stories. Thank you for listening to My Funeral Home Stories. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please rate and review wherever you listen. It actually helps out a lot more than you think. Be sure to follow me on social media at Pomo and Kitsch. And also check out my album, Pomo and Kitsch, Fetch. Also available on the iHeartRadio app, Spotify, or wherever you listen to music. Thanks for listening.